Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we celebrate our first PhD in our Extraterrestrial Studies program at Ubiquity University. Before we dive into that domain, I want to just make a quick comment on world events in relation to something that I'm preparing for Humanity Rising probably next week. Uh, you've all been looking at what's going on in Davos with the various European leaders and then President Trump and his speech and the negotiations that took place around Greenland and his Council for Peace in Gaza and various other aspects of geostrategic affairs having to do with Ukraine. Many of you have been watching what's been going on domestically in the United States with the ICE abduction of, little children, a 5-year-old little boy yesterday in Minneapolis, and wondering just sort of what is going on. And I want to just note something that I will be pondering on our collective behalf that comes out of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who wrote an essay in the 1930s on stupidity. And he said that stupidity is often more dangerous than evil. Evil, he said, is generally focused, intentional, intelligent in some way, and therefore observable, and it's possible for you to counter it. Stupidity, he said, is much more subtle because it's coming from a combination of lack of awareness and lack of critical thinking. I think that's important for us to bear in mind as we observe world events, and in particular, the actions and the speeches of the President of the United States. We're witnessing stupidity at very high levels. And that is what has caught the world off guard, and in particular, Europe, as the United States seizes Greenland and ends up with a negotiated success that is exactly what the agreement negotiated over 30, 40 years ago has already put in place. And so if you're bewildered at what's going on, it's of solace to bear in mind Bonhoeffer's essay on stupidity. And so I just wanted to put that out there as a way for people to start to just kind of considering what's uh, uh, taking place out there in the larger world. And it's something that I'm going to be dealing with in some detail over the next couple of weeks. It's a wonderful thing to be uh, working as we are in the interface between Ubiquity University and the State of the World Forum and Humanity Rising, because the foundational truths of the State of the World Forum combine the major data points of our time: ecological collapse, dysfunction in human affairs, exponential AI, and the reality that technologically advanced non-human intelligences are here on Earth. And that allows us to traverse basically all the major issues that are challenging humankind, from the ecological to the human domain, to the technical domain, to the cosmic domain. And it's our ability to keep all these different aspects like balls in the air, understanding that they may appear to be distinct, but actually they're all interconnected at a very deep level. And that's what, as you all know, I love to ponder is the interconnection between these dots. And it is in that spirit that I want to uh, note that last week, Ubiquity University produced the first PhD in history in extraterrestrial studies. And I want to just pause around that milestone. If you think about the fact that beginning in 1945, 80 years ago, the UFO phenomenon has been a major happening in global affairs. And yet the US government, in conjunction with other governments, decided to keep the reality of technologically advanced non-human intelligence a complete secret. And not only keep it a complete secret, but convince academia and religious institutions and civic institutions and the entertainment industry to act as if the issue didn't even exist. With such success, they were really good at it, with such success that if you even talked about UFOs, you were considered kind of crazy and psychologically deranged in a certain way. And yet, just because something is denied doesn't mean it's not. And those people who poke their head above the sand and said, wait a minute, no, I think it's round, like Copernicus or Galileo or Giordano Bruno were persecuted. Giordano Bruno was burnt at the stake. Galileo was exiled, forced to recant. Copernicus didn't even publish his theories in his lifetime. He was so afraid. But the world was still round. And slowly, laboriously, the information came out, and now we've embraced the obvious. After 80 years, Ubiquity University decided to do something that was initially ridiculed. I'm the president of the university. I can't tell you how many people said to me, Jim, you do not want to do this. This will ruin the reputation of Ubiquity if you start an extraterrestrial studies program awarding master's and PhD degrees. But like Copernicus and Galileo and Bruno before us, and hundreds and thousands of others who stood up for what the actual truth is, we decided to go ahead anyway. And in partnership initially with the New Paradigm Institute and then more recently with transdimensional mapping, Bertie Jaworski and the remote viewing community, we opened our doors to a master's and PhD program. And then we've been welcoming probably, I think, upwards of 20, 25 students in our program that have been taking a series of courses conducted by the great luminaries of the UFO movement and writing their dissertations. And last week, we had our first actually stellar PhD by a captain in the US Air Force, John Prorock, who really distinguished himself with his clarity his intellectual rigor, and added to what Ubiquity University, since the very beginning of our PhD program, has endeavored to uphold as a PhD program at the highest levels of scientific rigor. Our PhD program matches anything coming out of the major universities, whether it's the Harvard University or the University of Berlin or the University of Beijing. Our PhDs and our graduate degrees are world class, thanks to the Dean of Graduate Studies, Dr. Georgie Szabo, who took her PhD at the Sorbonne. My PhD was from the University of Cambridge. So we have held to those standards of excellence. So even though we're small, the rigor of our requirements are very, very high. So a PhD from Ubiquity University, for any of those who might be interested in our extraterrestrial studies program or any of our other programs, is something that will be a major milestone in your life to complete something like this. But today, in honor of this milestone, which is going to go down in history, maybe as a small footnote, but nevertheless a milestone, we want to welcome Captain John Prorock. So, John, if you'll open your video and take yourself off mute. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the first PhD in history on the matters of extraterrestrial studies. So, John, why don't we start with just providing our global audience a little bit about your background and tell us about your journey. How did you um, go down the rabbit hole of extraterrestrial studies? Why was this an issue that just gripped your mind and your soul so fervently that you ended up doing a PhD in this domain?
Absolutely, Jim. I appreciate you having me on. Hello to everyone worldwide. It's exciting to be here. Exciting to get to address everybody. It's something I've always been extremely interested in, and particularly from the scientific background. It's just something that throughout my life I've always been particularly curious about the Drake equation, and we look at the mathematical calculations that when we look at where is life, and are we alone, the big questions that humanity has traditionally asked throughout our history, that question of are we alone. And we look at, we say from the shoulders of giants, we talk about Frank Drake and Enrico Fermi. We get there and we calculate that the universe should realistically be teeming with life, per the math that the science says that there should be life everywhere. Yet, where is it? That's the creates the paradox is that, we run the Drake equation. We calculate that statistically there should be life everywhere. Yet when we look for the hard science and when we look for the proof, we listen out for our neighbors, we come up empty. And I think, to me, it was a matter of really just working to reconcile that and look for, potential solutions and a lot of, reasons why that may be the case, and kind of, get to the bottom of that and hopefully prepare humanity for, what will one day be our, our coming into the universe moment, when that, moment comes when we which I do believe one day will happen, when we have that, mass contact and we truly learn, that okay, this is our first large scale, entrance into the galactic neighborhood, so to say. So I think it's important that, whether that happens in our lifetime or sometime in the future, I think it's key and critical that we have these discussions now and we keep things moving in a positive direction and an open-mindedness to, what science has and what it tells us and what the limits are, and things that we have not yet discovered, because I believe that, that's where the steps forward lie, or in the innovation and the the willingness to question, as you so eloquently put it, earlier with, like, you look at Copernicus, during his time, and a lot of those, the mavericks of science were the ones who pushed the boundaries a little bit, were the ones who asked the questions, were the ones who were willing to apply the scientific method and pushed forward in realms that were, maybe criticized, a lot of skepticism, a lot of questioning. Um, so my dissertation was human space exploration, the search for defining and searching for life beyond Earth's biosphere. So that was something I dove pretty heavily into, and I'm excited to speak about today.
Good. Well, let's unpack for people just so everyone understands. Talk a little bit more about the Fermi paradox and the Drake equation, because you've used those two terms, but just fill those out because those were central to your methodology in your dissertation to get to your conclusion. So start with the Fermi paradox, and then the Drake equation. How did you bring those two together?
Absolutely, and I love that you asked that. I actually have a book upcoming in about a month about just that topic. It'll be called "The Great Silence: A Journey Through the Fermi Paradox." So I'm really excited about that because I think that's the key question. Is that's
Yeah,
the
yeah,
the
yeah.
the big thing that comes up. So we look at to start this off, we have Frank Drake, who was a brilliant doctor from his time, and he wrote this equation that effectively calculates, and he was known for being able to calculate things down to very precise outcomes. And somebody one day approached him with that question and said, where is everybody? Are we alone? Are we not alone? What's your thoughts on that? So he took that to heart. He wanted to give a real a strong answer. So he wrote what an equation that now bears his name, and the equation effectively brings in all of the variables. It's a mathematical equation with philosophical concepts, and it effectively brings in all the variables that we would use to determine the likelihood and the statistical odds of having life occur throughout the universe. So he factors in the amount of stars we can see in the observable universe, the longevity of those stars, the likelihood of planets, how many planets belong to each star, the likelihood of those planets being in what we call the habitable zone, or you'll hear the term the Goldilocks zone. So it's not too hot, not too cold, not too far, not too close to its parent sun. Basically, these planets where life, at least as far life as we know it, would be likely to occur, all the way down to looking at the longevity of life, and if these civilizations are out there, how long would they be realistically standing for. And when you plug in each of those variables, even by some of the most conservative estimates that have been produced by Mr. Drake himself, or excuse me, Dr. Drake himself, Dr. Carl Sagan, a lot of the even conservative estimates say that statistically life should be everywhere. And that's encouraging to a lot of people, who are looking to not be alone and to have an answer to that foundational question of, what it is to be a member of this galaxy. And that the problem that then creates is what Dr. Enrico Fermi, back in, I believe, the 50s, had his moment where he was very famous for doing math on napkins. He was the very typical. That's when you see the
He was
stereotypical,
old school.
Yep, yeah, old school. The stereotypical scattered scientist, doing quick math on napkins at the diner. That's effectively what happened, and I get into that in my book a little bit. Just the history of how that came about. I think it's an interesting story, but
Tell
so
the
what
story. It's a
Fermi.
very interesting story.
Certainly, yes. So he was at a diner with some. They were working a lot, at the time with physics, and this was the Cold War was very much intensifying. There was a lot going on with physics and that the background. So obviously they were all very well employed and very very hard worked. So as you can imagine, to decompress, they talk more about physics. So at the diner one day, him and a lot of his colleagues were talking about this, and the Drake equation came up, and they each took turns filling in the variables, what they thought was the appropriate figures to enter for each variable, and they all came up with different odds, and then Fermi asked the question. They all of those odds again came to the same conclusion that many before had come to, and said, yeah, there should statistically, the math is saying that there should be life, elsewhere. Like we should not at all. It's not like we are a statistical anomaly. there should be plenty of other life. And then Enrico asked a question that is kind of echoed through science ever since. He said, then where is everybody? And, those few words kind of quieted the table because it stumped everyone because, these were men of science, or men of hard math, and they calculated the numbers and said, yep, that should be a thing. And but then they're empty-handed. Then they have nothing that they can point to and go, oh, well, then there it is, or there they are. So I think that was, a big factor. And that question now bears the term of the Fermi paradox after Dr. Enrico Fermi. So the paradox being that we know for, the raw logic and math tells us the universe should be teeming with life. But then what we see, at least currently with our current technology in the observable universe that we see, we're not able to find hard, immediate evidence. So that creates then in against the math what they call the Fermi paradox. And there's a lot of really awesome philosophical answers to that question as to why that might be the case. Which is, again, my upcoming book really dives a lot into all of those theories. We can discuss them here at some point if you'd like. I think there's a lot of really awesome stuff there, but that is kind of the crux of a lot of these discussions, is that we look at Dr. Drake's equation, what that means, and then Dr. Fermi's logic, answer to that equation, and then the paradox that creates, because it's immediately contradicting itself.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let me bring in something that Carl Sagan said in one of our State of the World forums back between 1995 and 2000. We invited Dr. Sagan to speak, and he gave a very eloquent, beautiful presentation on what he called the little blue dot, which is what our Earth looks like from some of the photography from some of the spacecraft and satellites and so forth in the depths of space. And then during the question and answer period, someone asked him about UFOs and what he thought about uh, extraterrestrial life and so forth. And he gave a statistic that I found kind of arresting. He said, listen, if you assume that there's 100 million planets out there in our galaxy that have life, and then you assume that all 100 million of them wanted to come to Earth, which he said is a very big assumption that they would actually know about Earth and want to get to Earth. But he says if you get over that, and all 100 million sent spacecraft at the speed of light to Earth. He says our galaxy alone is so vast, one would only get here once every 100,000 years. And the audience gasped. And I think one of the aspects of the Fermi paradox and the Drake equation is that we lose sight of the vastness of space. That from Earth to anywhere else is a exceedingly long way. And I've never forgotten that statistic. And I don't know whether you agree with it, but that's what Dr. Sagan said back, I think it was in 1995 at our first State of the World Forum. So how does that fit into your cosmology and this relationship between sort of the statistical certainty that they're out there and the reality that they're not showing up? Because I think we think that the universe is actually a lot smaller than it actually is.
Absolutely. I'm a huge fan of Dr. Sagan's work. Right. I think, but below me, down in my basement right now, I think I have 5 or 6 of his books stacked up. A lot of research from him went into my dissertation and my book and a lot of upcoming works. I think that is what, first of all, one of the key things to remember is that, when we say statistically life should be everywhere, well, if I said, there should be people everywhere in this room, then it would mean that there's a lot of people I can talk to. Where, if I say there should be a lot of people in my neighborhood, then I can't, it would require some effort to go and speak to them. And then, the further out you go, if I say there are a lot of people on the planet, and that the more you spread out, suddenly we're talking about having to take a plane flight to go see somebody. The further we spread out, when you look at the sheer size of the cosmos, that is important to remember that when we say there should be life everywhere, just because we don't immediately see it within our immediate grasp with our current technology, and what we know to look for as what we define as life, certainly does not mean that that is not the case elsewhere. So, and does not mean that it's not there to find eventually, and out there. And there's a lot of reasons why that could be the case. If we look at future technology, a lot of hypothetical, technology and futuristic ideas. I think there are some ways, potentially that you could you look at like Dr. Michio Kaku discusses a lot of theoretical physics. I've got a lot of his books as well. A lot of really interesting ideas for potential, faster than light travel and warping, and black holes, wormholes, all sorts of different phenomenon, that in theory could provide faster ways to travel, than light, faster than light communication, faster than light travel. I think looking at quantum entanglement, something really exciting. So that is cutting edge stuff. It's certainly not something I can come here and say, yeah, I think we'll have that next year. That would be quite a while if it's even possible. But I think it's exciting to, to look at some of these potential answers and say, just within our extremely limited scope as humanity, um, we are already beginning to conceive of these ideas, cold fusion, light sails, zero point energy, just a lot of these interesting concepts that just within our framework as a very relatively young species, we're already starting to think of and question. So, I think, again, it's not something I would ever want to shut out and just refuse to acknowledge the possibility that there could be more out there, and that there could potentially be connections at some point between two civilizations.
Good. Well, listen, let's dive into your actual dissertation for a bit, John, because what I really liked about your dissertation, and by the way, everyone, I was in on his oral examination committee. And the way that works is when you submit your PhD dissertation, there's a committee, there's your major advisor, there's an external examiner that doesn't know anything about you or have any connection, so it's completely dispassionate. And then myself and Dr. Zabo, who's the Dean of Graduate Studies. So there were four people examining John in an oral exam that generally lasts hour and a half, 2 hours. And then on the basis of that, having all of us read his dissertation, talked with him at length and deeply about his logic and his conclusions, then we vote as to whether he passes. Sometimes a candidate is judged to be deficient in one way or another, and they have to kind of go back to the drawing boards and resubmit. And so that's what happens in an oral exam at the PhD level. And I think we were all intrigued by the way John constructed his investigation, because he did it in a really interesting and innovative way. Normally, in a scientific paper, you limit yourself to, the Drake equation or, the Fermi paradox, and you don't go out of the scientific reductionist box. But what John did was expand that and bring in many other factors, including ancient wisdom and multicultural experience of this phenomenon to draw his conclusion. So, John, uh, talk to us about how you constructed your research and the conclusion that you came as a result of your research.
Absolutely. So I wanted to really bring in that piece of it, because when we're having these discussions, I certainly I think that it would be foolish of us to ignore the fact that we have these wisdom and traditions from ancient cultures who seem to discuss all this. I think we've all seen the show, the shows on the History Channel and everything where there's a lot of people who have all of these very profound stories and a lot of unexplained mysteries. You very quickly get into that rabbit hole of discussion, which is exciting. And there's I think it would be foolish of us to not consider some of this past wisdom and some of these stories. Our ancestors were certainly not fools. I think they know what they were trying to tell us, and I think it's important to keep a mindful approach to a lot of that, and to be able to kind of bridge the gaps between what traditional wisdom and modern what we would call knowledge or science. I think that's extremely important. um I think that's over time we'll begin to reconcile that, and it's interesting. A lot of times throughout history, the two, when we talk about wisdom and culture and science, they tend to interweave sometimes. Sometimes points in history they've seen relatively far apart. A lot of times they've been pretty much in lockstep and come to the same conclusion. And I think the term consciousness is something you're going to hear quite a lot of moving forward in the future. Um, and I think there's, the more we get into looking at the universe as a whole and looking at expanding human consciousness and what that means, I think you're going to notice that a lot of these concepts are, and a lot of these cultural beliefs from history are a lot more integrated into what we're now viewing through a lens of quantum physics and consciousness and different experiments. If you want an interesting one to look at, the double slit experiment. I talked about that in my dissertation. If you're interested in looking that up at any point, but I think that there's, we're now finding with science that there are a lot of phenomenon that can be more explained by saying, actually, this sounds a lot like, the wisdom of ancient cultures. Are we just rediscovering things that our ancestors have been trying to tell us? And I think, that's very important to make sure that we are appreciating, lessons from the past and taking in lessons from our ancestors who were very clearly trying to communicate, what they believe to be profound things. You're not drawing something in a cave or chiseling it into a stone if for the future if you don't think it's important for someone to read later.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's tease that out a bit. Tell us, what ancient wisdom traditions you were particularly struck by, and how that ancient wisdom corresponds to something like the double slit experiment. Describe that, because what was innovative about your dissertation was the way you brought all those aspects together.
Certainly, yeah. So I think so to start, for anyone who's not familiar, this will be a very 40,000 foot view down of just a quick oversight of what the double slit experiment is. A famous experiment where they were firing particles through a single slit and then through two slits. So consider firing pellets through a box that had one and then two splits in it. And what they were finding were various interference and wave patterns where you would expect to see the particles behaving in a certain way. And when they were checking the screen effectively that was catching these particles, what they noticed was they were getting different results than they expected. So they said, all right, why are we not seeing the two lines? Why are we seeing a wave function here? And they put a meter in to detect and to be able to see. But then they noticed, well, the results changed. They say as soon as they observed the experiment, the results changed and the wave function collapsed into a more predictable particle flow, if you will. And what we have effectively, and again, I'm trying to very quickly to push through this, but what they effectively have determined from that is something that we've pulled called the observer effect, which gets into, we have found that for whatever reason these particles and a lot of things in the universe behave differently when they are being observed, which was odd because when we look at experiments, we it kind of goes counterintuitive to what we know about a lot of our science. If I was to drop this pen, we would expect it to fall, and we understand gravity. And I don't think anyone would question, if we all shut our eyes and I drop the pen, I don't think many people would be saying, well, it's probably floating or doing something different now, since I'm not watching. We trust the science, we trust the math, to say, well, just because I'm not watching it, we understand that how gravity works, and we appreciate that when he drops the pen, it's going to fall whether I watch it or not. But when we look at the double slit experiment, that's not what happened. They noticed that it's led to a lot of theories, that we look at what is consciousness and how does it interact with reality. So it appears based on that experiment and similar experiments of that nature that observation collapses the wave function and forces it to choose a specific outcome. So I think the more when you get into that, I think it begins to interweave. I liked what you said in the beginning of it starts to stretch. It was kind of at the outer edge of where I wanted to go with my dissertation because I'm like, well, what does this have to do with searching for life? But I decided to include it because I thought, well, I think it may be a better answer than we think. I think it may be a little more relevant to the conversation than we think because as we get into these ideas of consciousness, I think it's going to be critical that we appreciate what consciousness is, and we're just barely beginning to appreciate the limits of what that may mean for our spiritual selves and our galactic purpose in the universe, just beyond this immediate uh physical plane here, where we're headed and how we may interact with other beings. And that's I think the way I kind of tie that back in is looking at what are, if we were to theoretically encounter the higher intelligence beings, if we define life as just something physical that I can walk in and shake its hand and say hello, then that's one interpretation of what an encounter with that being may look like. But there may be a reason that a lot of these stories from our ancestors are described more as spiritual or almost religious events to them. There was a lot of ways that they interpreted it. But I think it's important to kind of acknowledge that such events may be more of a profound experience of consciousness, or contact may occur in ways that are different than we would expect. It might not be a matter of physically shaking hands with the being standing in front of you. These encounters may manifest or have manifested in the past as other types of experiences, other experiences of consciousness. um Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I think we're on to something very profound, just going back to Dr. Sagan for a moment. Back in the 80s and 90s, there was no notion really that anything could travel faster than the speed of light. And then you have all these experiments, a double slit experiment and the whole theory of entanglement and little photons, over vast distances affect one another. And there's no idea of how that's happening, but we know that it is happening, that the observer and the observed are interconnected at the quantum level. And so what is emerging is that not only that consciousness is real, but that it's perfectly possible to travel instantaneously, not limited by the speed of light. And further, this UFO phenomenon is not limited to, sentient beings traveling from Alpha Centauri or the star system Sirius or constellation Gemini or someplace like that, but through different dimensions, not only of space, but of time. So that one of the things that's so exciting about our world right now and our understanding of not only physics, but the possibility of other sentient intelligence is that consciousness is the reality, not matter. and that dimensions of space and time, which are existing simultaneously with us, are actually interpenetratable. And beings are now beginning to circulate in our observable perception from sources that we don't fully understand. So, that we've come a long way from sort of the Drake equation and Dr. Fermi's paradox, because that was assuming that space was normative and that that's where all the other little beings are. But when you get into consciousness, space and time, as Einstein said, become part of one another. And the whole thing explodes into an infinite series of possibilities that are existing simultaneously and are all interconnected. So I just love to have your response as a researcher to this phenomenon, because I think it's deliciously layered and nuanced.
Certainly, and I think that's a great kind of segue into that answer of where does this tie in to how do we get from the Fermi paradox to the observer effect, and I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there when you said that we're learning that it might not necessarily be a question of physically traveling a distance. That is us observing the way we live in our immediate world, but the more we look into concepts such as consciousness, I think that to me is where you can start to have a lot of fun with getting more into theoretical physics and just different bring in almost philosophical arguments applications to the the science of looking at it may very well be the case that there is a direct relationship between consciousness and reality. Does observation collapse the wave functions around us into a stable reality? Is our consciousness and our active observation required to anchor down what we would call the our stable reality that we live in? And like you said, I think as we get more understanding of that and as we broaden ourselves to that concept, I think it's really exciting, as a potential theory to say maybe that is why you see more reports and more people who talk about having encounters and having these experiences, because maybe to a certain degree the more enlightened we become to our own consciousness and our own interaction with reality and the universe, that could be starting to border the edges and clip into other realms that other beings can
Exactly.
interact. I think it's a really exciting theory. It's one of those things. One day, I think we'll be able to explain it on a chalkboard with a couple lines and say, "Yep, we figured this out." It'll be that was a breakthrough. But I love those kind of theoretical applications and theoretical answers to some of these problems, because there's just such enough out there that when you look at quantum entanglement and some of these interesting phenomena, the possibilities are endless. And to me, that's the exciting part, is that when we make some of those base like entry level discoveries, when we first split atom, when we first discover quantum entanglement, then saying, well, where do we go from here? And that's the explosion, no pun intended, of science for me. Is that gets a lot of people interested to think to where can we go with this, and what's the next step? What is the application of some of these new phenomena we're observing?
Well, what I particularly loved about your dissertation was its conclusion, John. So I'd like to have you talk about your conclusion of statistical certainty, because you didn't hedge your bets. You actually stated the obvious. So talk to us about how you arrived at the conclusion that there was a statistical certainty that other sentient beings exist in our universe.
Absolutely, yeah. So, discussing this, I thought a lot, about how I wanted to kind of conclude things and, where my thoughts were. And I thought, at the end, I just want to give my personal opinion based on, what I have researched and based on, the physics, the astrochemistry, the astrobiology, even looking at earthly zoology, and it's a lot of what we know about life, and then the application of philosophy and cultural wisdom, and kind of bringing it all together. And that was just kind of my final determination. Was, I looked at it and I said, I feel that life out there in some form or some way, that I cannot bring myself to believe that we're all, and that we are the only beings out there, that this is just a one planet universe. And I think that was, just something that to me became pretty readily apparent. And the more I thought about it, and the more I began to believe it, I thought, well, you know what, if that's where the data is driving me to conclude, then I think I need to make that conclusion. And it's exciting. Again, there's a lot of further applications of that conclusion. The way we talk, okay, so, if you do believe life is out there, do you believe it can come into contact? How? Why? What might it look like? So all of the questions open up when you're willing to, acknowledge, look, reasonably. I think I've heard Dr. Kakus and others say several times, that the burden of proof has kind of, the scales have tipped, where it,
Mhm.
it used to be, you were the tinfoil hat, guy, you were the one in the room that, everyone would kind of have a laugh over when you said, oh, I believe there's something else out there. And, it was, you had to prove it. And I think at this point, just based on, a lot of what we've seen with astrochemical missions, a lot of NASA work, the Drake equation, a lot of philosophical Fermi paradox resolutions. I think when you take a comprehensive look at things, we've kind of tipped the scale, in favor of life. And now I would argue that the onus is on those who do not believe to disprove life, to show me where it could not be. How there could not be anything else. Because I think when you look at the vastness of the universe, and the limited data set and the facts that we do have, we're starting to see, that there are at least the building blocks everywhere. To me, I think that the final tipping point was that astrochemical side of things. Some of the major, kind of aha moments in my mind were when we look at confirmation of the base nucleotides in our DNA and RNA have all been found to exist outside of the Earth's biosphere, so in space. When we look at the capabilities of tardigrades, or commonly called water bears, to survive in very extreme conditions, that would not be hospitable to us, or certainly, or to many animals on Earth. And looking at 70% of the proteinogenic amino acids, so the so-called building blocks of life, 70% of those have been discovered to exist outside of the Earth's biosphere. We look at finding water. We have observed via spectroscopy and plumes that we've seen from certain different telescopes, of plumes in Europa coming up, that we know there is almost certainly a liquid ocean on Jupiter's moon Europa. And I think, when you start bringing all this together, it paints a story. I say, so if the building blocks of life and all of the chemicals, we look at the CHNOPS, posse of elements that are said to be the major life-giving elements. They are abundant throughout the universe. And when we look at having all of these pieces and saying, so we got all of that, we have liquid water, the universal solvent, and we're not even outside of our solar system. We're one grain of sand over in the entire, beach of everywhere to look at. And I'm like, well, you know what? If we have all of this evidence, to me, I can't say, I can't come up with any other conclusion other than saying, yeah, there has to be more out there. And then I believe then it's a more interesting conversation to, just because then you can really go down into the theories of, well, what might that life look like? And, will they make contact? Could they make contact? Could we make contact? What would that look like, and how would that manifest? And, to me, that's where it gets very exciting, and you can start to very quickly get into, theoretical application of many fields of science, and into how it all plays a part.
Let me ask you a final question, because we've now reached the conclusion, everyone, that there's a statistical certainty in John's view, that non-human intelligence exists. The question then is, how do we humans on our little tiny blue dot interact and orient ourselves to these beings? And there's two main orientations. One that you hear a lot from the intelligence community, the military, many of the books out there, is that it's a national security issue. You hear this in the US Congress all the time. This is a national security issue. They're a potential threat. They have the capability because they're so technically advanced. They may have the intent to be malevolent, and therefore we should essentially be afraid, protect ourselves, weaponize the relationship just in case they're the bad guys. The other orientation, which is what uh, many in the UFO community uh, have espoused, is that no, they've been here for a very long time, and there's no evidence of hostility or ill will. In fact, there's evidence that they're concerned about our nuclear weapons, about our ecological damage, and so forth, and that they're technologically advanced, but their intent is benign. And therefore, humans should orient ourselves in an open-hearted, open-handed, friendly way to collaborate and co-create. So, John, having studied this as you have, where do you come out on this question of orientation of humanity, whether in a national security framework or an open-hearted framework of friendship? Where do you come out, given that there's a
Absolutely.
statistical certainty that these beings exist?
I think if we were, to have that moment, where the, some civilization, in theory, attempts to initiate, this mass contact, and how do we present ourselves in that scenario? I think it's one of those things where, fortunately, you don't have to choose, a side. I certainly think it's worth saying that, any civilization that could cross the galaxy, to come see us could probably, do what they wanted to us if they wanted to. So I think that when you walk through the logic of, the potential hostile intent, I think it is, kind of reassuring just to think through and think, well, if they are that far ahead, then, there's not much we can do about it anyway. But I think, realistically, what that tells me then is that, well, you know, we have to assume that there is, a reason that this contact would be made, and there's a lot to gain, and to put our best foot forward. And I look at it, as just meeting a stranger on the street. You don't entirely have to let your guard down to be open, and to say hello, and start a dialogue with somebody. You're taking a risk anytime you interact with a brand new person. But we appreciate that. Well, there's also a lot to gain from that situation. So I think fortunately you don't have to let your guard down entirely. We don't, we can keep in mind, it's natural to be afraid of the dark, and there's gonna be some fear there, and there's gonna be a lot of people, who are very uncomfortable with that kind of idea. So I think it's important to, keep everyone's thoughts in mind, because likewise there are a lot of people who are bewildered with the idea, and who hope that they're alive to see it, and to be a part of that critical step in the human experience. So I think it's really exciting, to see both sides, and to appreciate what each side brings to the table, because it's as important as it is to establish our own human sovereignty, and to present ourselves as a species capable of self-governance, and standing on its own. It's also important to acknowledge, hey, we may be a very small piece of what ends up being a very big galactic framework. Who knows what's out there. So it's, I think it's interesting to be able to kind of take both of those aspects into account, and kind of appreciate, there's a something interesting to say for kind of seeing where we are in things, and seeing how we stack up. And Interestingly, I don't know, in my opinion, that humanity will get the choice when that moment comes. If we're talking
Hmm.
theoretically about, beings that are that much further advanced, then, it'll probably be much more on their terms to see, well, how do they want to approach us? As the less developed, if any being is, crossing any of these planes to come and greet us, we may be caught in more of a reactive stance, than we want to be. And I think that's exciting as well. And something that again we have to ponder and kind of all decide for ourselves. Well, where do we want to be? How do we want to react? Because
Yeah,
everyone's going to have a different opinion. But that's a in my mind exciting because I think it can be kind of a unifier and something universal to the human experience to say, if we're thinking on these grand scales, they're not going to come and see different subgroups. They're going to just come and say, okay, this is humanity on Earth. So when we all have different opinions, different ways of approaching it, it's there's an irony there because when they approach us, they may just be approaching us saying, oh, okay, we'll pick one random person, and clearly they're going to speak for all of humanity. Which obviously what will not be the case, but it's when you think in those terms,
yeah,
it's interesting to have those discussions and have everyone. It's something, and that's what something I'm excited to get my book out there because I want everyone to think about it. I want everyone to come to their
exactly,
own conclusions.
exactly.
And when I walk through different hypotheses, dark forest theory, simulation theory, there's so many different ideas. Try to present everything in a way where I'm just going to give the logic behind why a lot of people buy into this concept, and then you decide for yourself what your thoughts are, and then come find me, grab jump onto one of the social media pages up for the book, and let's talk about it because that's where the exciting stuff happens.
Great. Well, when the ETs come and they pick somebody, I hope they pick somebody like you, John.
Well, I appreciate it. I don't know. We'll see.
Well, thank you so much, John Prorock, everyone, the first PhD in history in extraterrestrial studies, concluding that there is a statistical certainty that non-human intelligences exist in our universe. And he's got a book coming out. He'll probably be also publishing his dissertation. So watch out, look for John Prorock on the New York Times bestseller list. And that will conclude our session for today. John will join the after chat so you can talk with him more deeply and more informally. You receive the Zoom reminder, the link in the Zoom reminder for today, and also you can see the link in the chat box. John, thank you. And again, congratulations, my friend. You've done a great service to the U.S. Air Force, and you've done a great service to Ubiquity University by being the first PhD in extraterrestrial studies in history. Well done.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. It's been wonderful, and I look forward to a lot of collaboration in the future.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. See you next